Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to paint grass. Now I've got the painting in the corner there, and the reason why I've enlarged this quite a bit compared to my other videos is so that you can see just how much of the grass is in this painting, but also once we are working on a smaller area here, this grass I find is a bit too easy to keep on modifying because it doesn't look right. Only if you then take a step back and you look at the painting as a whole, the grass looks really realistic. So when we're working on something like this where the process is quite tedious, it's just repeating the same layering process with the same brush, it can start to become, as I say, very repetitive. So what I do when I'm painting grass is I regularly take a step back from my easel and I look at the painting as a whole to make sure that I'm happy with the depth and the realism that I'm getting in that section of grass. So this was a large painting, so this was 29 by 21 inches and it's of my own two dogs. I therefore had to make sure that the grass and the individual blades of grass were the right length in relation to the size of the dogs. And that's something that can be quite important, especially when we are working on the fur as well. Depending on how big we're going, this painting was larger than life size, so I had to make sure that my brush strokes replicated that within the fur and the grass itself. Now it's not just the length of the brush strokes, it's also the thickness of those brush strokes. So what I'm working on here is a slightly larger round brush, but the biggest tip that I can give anybody is make sure that your grass is random, that they're curving in different ways, that some of them are bending and curving in the opposite direction. What we don't want to do is make this grass look uniform. When we're working on something like this, it's really easy to carry on moving our hand in exactly the same motion, and what we end up doing is then creating grass that's in a strict line, and then also each blade of grass looks identical. Obviously anything in nature is not straight and it is also not identical, so we want to make sure that the biggest thing we're capturing here is the randomness of this grass. By using the same brush but putting a little bit more pressure on that brush, you're going to be able to create a thicker line. You can see that some of these brush strokes are thicker than others, while some have got more of a chiseled point to that brush, and I'm able to then get a much thinner, softer line in how that grass is curving over. So there are a couple of things that I would recommend right from the beginning, and the first is to start off with a green base of some kind. You can map in where your shadows and your highlights, where the main clumps of grasses are should you want to, but the biggest thing I would say is start off with a green base. I'm then working from dark to light, so I've mixed a dark green to start with, and each additional layer that I'm adding here, I'm adding a little bit more of a yellow and more of my titanium white. Now what that's going to be enabling me to do is create more depth within this grass gradually. My main aim with each additional layer is that I want to cover that very first solid light green background that I put down to start with. I don't really want much of that to show through. So what I need to do is carry on building depth, but with different layers that are slightly, not only a different colour, but a different tone. So with each additional layer I will get lighter, and then if I need to, I can then mix my darker colour again and then add some more shadows. Now depending on the type of grass that we are painting, it's going to be a little bit different in some cases. This was just a freshly cut field, so the grass was, maybe an inch at most, and because this was larger than life size, I knew that I had to make my brush strokes in relation to that at the same size. So if you do struggle with knowing how long your brush strokes need to be and how thick they need to be, what can be really useful is to print off your reference photo that you're working from, the same size as your artwork, and what that will do is it will actually enable you to see that right in front of you with how long you need to make your brush strokes. That can be something that can be really beneficial, because if we make these brush strokes too short or too long, we're going to be completely changing the texture of that grass. Something that I also find when I'm painting grass, with any medium really, drawing as well, that goes through many ugly stages. Now at the moment this looks terrible, it really does look fake, but the one biggest thing that I've learned when painting grass is to keep at it. The more layers that you add, the more realistic it will get. But even at this stage here, you can see how random my brush strokes are. I'm not putting these highlighted blades of grass everywhere. I don't want to completely make the whole grass look as bright as other areas. If you look at the finished painting in the corner, there is a very strong light source coming from behind both of the dogs. So I want to make sure that I've captured that shadow from the body and where their legs are in front of them. Now the section of the grass that I'm working on is the right hand side of Lexi, my Springer Spaniel. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that light that's really reflecting off of that grass in that area. So I do have this whole tutorial, the 40-minute version, much slower footage, available on my Patreon channel. You can see clearly how I'm moving that brush because it all is predominantly in real time. So I'll link my Patreon channel in the description below if that is of interest. I've also got a Patreon library on my website where you can see all of the tutorials of my pastel and acrylic tier. So if that is of interest, as I say, all of the information will be linked below. So for this I used two brushes. I used a round brush, quite a larger size 6, and then I also used a thinner liner brush, which is what I'm using at the moment. Now you can get a rake brush and you can also get a fan brush. Both of those can be used for grass. Now for me, they're not my preference because I do find that they end up making the grass look far too uniformed. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, you want these brush strokes to be random to replicate how grass naturally is. When you've got one brush that can make multiple brush strokes that are all the same, you're going to end up with something that is very structured, and that's just my personal preference. They do have their place, just like any brush, but for me, I like creating grass with the method that I'm showing you here because I do think it gives you the most out of that reference photo. We want to make sure that all of these brush strokes are staggered. We don't want them to, as I say, look structured or uniform. Now that is just my personal preference, but as I say, for something like this, especially because it was on such a large scale, I wanted to make sure that I did give that indication that almost looked like I painted every single blade of grass, when of course I didn't, but I wanted it to look like it had as much depth. Now that being said, if I was painting a landscape and I had grass in the distance, I wouldn't want to be adding all of this detail. So therefore a rake brush would be perfect for that kind of grass. So as I say, I find that they do have their place, but for something like this, when I'm trying to capture all of this detail in this area, these kinds of brushes are my preference. I like to use the larger, thicker brushes for my first few layers, and then for these more detailed layers where the blades of grass get a little bit more finer, I switched over to my liner brush. And as I've already mentioned, the more layers that I'm adding, you are struggling now to see that very first green base layer, and that really is my aim. And when it comes to the reference photo, I am looking at it regularly, but not as much as I would be if I was painting fur when it came to Maisie and Lexi themselves. All I'm going for is making sure that my shadows and my highlights are in the right place. No one is going to look at the finished painting and think, well, she hasn't got enough blades of grass in that area, because I've put so many layers here, and even now when we get to the end of the video there will be a big difference compared to what you can see at the moment. No one's going to look at it and think that it is incorrect because I just have so many brush strokes in this area. And if you're finding your grass is not as realistic as you'd like, it usually is just because you haven't added enough layers. If I was painting grass that was much shorter than this, if for instance the painting was on a smaller scale, you might not have the same room to add all of this kind of detail. I would be doing the same process of what I'm working here from dark to light and then adding some of my shadows in after if I needed to, but I would significantly be reducing how long these brush strokes are. In some cases, as soon as that brush hits that canvas, you want to be easing off on that pressure to create that nice tapered effect and really short brush strokes. And throughout every layer, some of these brush strokes here, I've applied more pressure to my brush to get a thicker line. Every single blade of grass is going to be a slightly different length and a different thickness, so we really want to make sure that we capture that in the painting as well. Now I had a very strong warm yellow light source in the reference photo, so with each additional layer, especially on these last couple of layers, I added quite a lot more yellow to my mixture to make sure that my grass tied in with the light source and the white balance of the two dogs themselves. If this didn't have as much of the warmer light source, I would be adding more blues to my green mixture, but for something like this I really did want to hype up that yellow saturation within the grass. And here's the finished painting. So now that this is on an even larger scale, you can see how we're not focused on that grass. It looks like grass because of how many brush strokes I've got in there, but the dogs are still the main focus, but the grass has all of that depth. That's only been achieved because of the amount of layers and individual brush strokes have been put in at each of that point, working from dark to light, building up those lighter values gradually. Now, if I'd have painted in those lighter tones right from the very beginning, there wouldn't be nowhere near as much depth as what there is here. You can see as well there's a very strong shadow in front of the dog's paws where that light source from the back is really casting that shadow at the front. So all of these additional elements really do make a difference in the overall depth and contrast within the painting. So I really hope this video was of use. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you want to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and I'll be uploading another video here at the weekend.